Hello, I'm Llewellyn King, the host of White House Chronicle, which is coming right up. But first, a few thoughts of my own. I've been very lucky recently. I managed to get a cruise around Cape Horn, going from Argentina to Chile. Absolutely astounding. I had read books like Dana's 2 years before the mast, and here I was doing it on a luxury liner. Well, it wasn't quite that luxurious because there was a lot of swell and many of the passengers and a lot of the crew were sick. But I was blown away that you can do that nowadays. Sometimes in the middle of all of the travail that we see in life, I'm struck by how fortunate one is to live in this time when one can do things that were not contemplatable previously, like flying an airplane, going around the world, having music, wherever you wanted, whenever you wanted. These are enormous quality of life things, knowing that you can do them, and of course music. I mention music because you may not think about this, but 100 years ago you had to go to church to hear music, or if you were lucky enough to have a musician in your family. Things can be difficult, but they also can be quite grand in the times in which we live. We have a marvelous program today with great guests, beginning of course as always with Linda Gasparello, the co-host of this program.
Thank you, Llewellyn.
And we're very glad to have Farah Stockman today, who's an editorial writer and columnist for the Boston Globe, one of the great newspapers. Welcome to the broadcast, your first time, and I hope not your last time, but welcome. Thanks. How long have you been with the Boston Globe?
Since birth, about 15 years. It feels like since birth.
Well, that's a good long
Good
time.
chunk of your life.
We'll get into this later, but you lived in Africa for a while, where you started your journalistic career in Kenya.
I did, yeah.
Kenya, Tanzania.
Yep. It was quite an adventure.
And it brought you to, people ask us how to get started, and Linda's always told them, go to somewhere and start writing.
Sit down and start writing, right, Farah?
Prepare to starve and start writing.
I did starve, and I managed to write as well.
Oh, well, congratulations, and I'm so glad to welcome back one of the most gifted men I know, Edward Achorn, Vice President and editorial page editor of the Providence Journal, also a distinguished author who manages to turn out books on the side, highly readable books. Ed Achorn, welcome to the broadcast.
Thank you, Llewellyn.
Farah, let's begin with you. You have been writing recently and taking an interest in Iran. Linda once lived in Iran and speaks Farsi.
So she said, yeah.
So tell us, we're torn, the country is torn. Is Iran the great ugly? Is Saudi Arabia the great ugly? Are they both ugly, or is there a way forward here?
They might be both ugly. I hate to say it, but what happened this past weekend, Saudi Arabia executed 47 people, 4 of whom were Shia, 1 of whom was this very prominent cleric, and the cleric, I don't see a lot of evidence that he had anything to do with terrorism. I think he was a very outspoken against the Saudi royal family, but I don't see that I haven't even heard good evidence that he's incited violence. Am I wrong?
No.
So to me, Saudi Arabia is trying to keep all of its loyal, all the people who are interested in ISIS. Saudi Arabia has a very religiously extreme population. We never talk about it. We demonized Iran for so many decades, talking about their theocracy, talking about their religious extremism, talking about their oppression of women. But look at Saudi Arabia. All of those things are going on there too. So I don't know. I feel like they're both uglies this weekend, and Saudi Arabia is a population. It's a place where the government has been pro-American, but the people themselves tend to be anti-American, and I think Iran is the opposite. People are very pro-American in Iran, the average people, and the government has not been up until now. And I think we're going to see a change.
How do you read this, Linda?
I think we've got the unfortunate situation of an old rivalry that is now causing a lot of regional instability. It's really, really very unfortunate. Saudi Arabia made a point with these executions. Saudi Arabia's business is the business of Saudi Arabia in keeping the monarchy a viable monarchy. Those executions, 43 of which were Al-Qaeda, showed those that said, well, hey, you've got to do something about Al-Qaeda destabilizing Saudi Arabia and the region. So they did. With Iran, they wanted to show Iran that if you think that you can have a proxy war with the Houthis in Yemen, if you think you can destabilize other places like Lebanon and like Syria, then we're going to show you something there. Iran, for its part, has made a meal of this, turning Sheikh, the Iranian sheikh, into a martyr. And the Iranians do love martyrs. They're able to fire up their militias by saying that a martyr has been killed. It's something that I think Iraq is trying to tamp down right now, because Iraq has alliances with both Iran and Saudi Arabia. And if we don't get this tamped down, it will derail the Syrian peace talks that are coming up in Geneva.
I think for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, we should mention there's an asymmetry in the size of these countries.
There is an asymmetry.
Saudi is a small country in terms of population, an awful lot of desert, but a small country. What is the population? Do you know offhand? It's around 11 million, I think.
Sounds about right.
And Iran is
like
90 million.
90 million.
And this is a big difference. And Iran is a very ancient country, the Persians, a great deal of pride. And interestingly, as you said, the population leans towards America. They never had a beef with us. The religious leaders had a beef. Ed, you've been very patient. Come on in.
I think this does show shifting alliances in that region. The United States was unable to persuade Saudi Arabia not to execute this cleric and all these people, and that created the fact we do not have that kind of clout with Saudi Arabia anymore is quite striking, and I think it shows.
Can I just ask you, when did we have that kind of clout? I remember when George W. Bush went over there to get them to pump more oil and they turned him down. We have always shown them enormous consideration, and it's not always been reciprocated.
That's very true, but we've always sort of been able to work with them as a stabilizing influence in that region, and I think whatever clout we had is being diminished as we turn towards Iran. And I think that makes this a very troubling period right now.
Also, there's a new king, isn't there? Relatively new, a very old man.
And of course, this spat between the two shows their internal motivations. You've got Iran with elections that are coming up, so they want to show that they are going to be strong against Saudi Arabia. At least the hardliners want to show that. And Saudi Arabia, of course, has got its own internal problems with secession. So I think here you've got the internal dynamics that are leading to, that are going to lead to a greater, if you can imagine a greater regional instability, but a greater one. If they can't get it together, it's going to fall on all of the rest of us. And as for President Obama and President Obama's policies, his policy has been to disengage from the area. It has had its consequences. Nobody ever disengages from the Middle East without consequences. You may want to leave the area, but the area never wants to leave you. And this is what's happening to the West with the refugees. It's going to be, even worse. But you've got them going tit for tat now with, the lowering of oil prices, and how much more do regional countries have to suffer because of this?
Is the price of oil, which was once over $100 a barrel and is now less than half of that. And these countries are not as rich as they were.
Absolutely.
And they depend on oil for everything.
It's a big deal. I think Saudi Arabia looked at the Paris conference and realized oil is not the future.
Right.
And up until this point, oil, they calculated the price of oil based on the idea that the oil left in the ground was very valuable. Now they're seeing that 50 years from now, we might not need that oil.
I was in Saudi, but quite a few years ago, when they were dealing with the first reduction in the price of oil after the wildness of the 70s and the early 80s. And they were wildly trying to value, because they were borrowing money. The rich Saudi Arabia was borrowing money. They were trying to value the oil in the ground, which is a very dangerous thing to do, assuming that nothing will change, that there will be an eternal demand for your commodity. Ed, you're smiling. I like that.
No, it's just extraordinary how these oil prices fluctuate, and I think they're going to continue to do so. It's based on...
But as for those who say we do not need Saudi Arabia anymore, we're pumping our own oil, we're getting oil from other places. Yeah. We still need Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia may think that we abandoned them because we promoted our interests during the Arab Spring in Egypt, for instance. But the fact is, and they felt threatened by that. They thought, if we are going to promote the pushing out of Mubarak, then would we also promote democracy movements in Saudi Arabia? So they've been paranoid about us, but we still need them, and we still 10 million barrels of oil a day. We still need these guys.
I found Saudi Arabia one of the most extraordinarily bizarre places that I have been, where you never see women ever. Not just that they're covered in black, you don't see them, black or otherwise, because they're not allowed on the streets, they're not in public, they're not in the hotels. There is no liquor unless you're a prince, in which case you probably have a lot of liquor, because there are problems with that. But you can't get a drink, but you'll sit in a nice restaurant and a French head waiter, paid an enormous amount of money, will say to you, "Monsieur, the chef he has made tonight a very special cocktail." And you'll say, "Yes, what? Huh? Huh?" And he says, "No, monsieur, not that kind of cocktail. It's fruit juice."
Right, but not to be funny about it.
And then they make jokes about, one man was boasting to me that, I said, "Well, why can't we ever see any women here?" He said, "I see plenty of women. I have an apartment in Paris."
Okay.
So the hypocrisy is so enormous.
Which is why we consider Saudi Arabia a force for stability, but there are questions about how stable it's going to be. When the price of oil goes down, or they won't be able to afford the welfare state that has kept them in power all this time.
Exactly.
And the I don't know, they're a little bit like Pakistan in that they have this really strange relationship with religious forces, and they get a lot of legitimacy from the religion, but they can create monsters, and they have. They really have.
Yes.
Well, that's interesting. Where do you think it goes? Do you have any clues?
Well, what I'm hoping is that this rivalry between Iran and Saudi Arabia does not further destabilize.
And remember, as Farah said at the beginning, this is the Sunni Shia division.
Yes, that's right, and that's what it is.
It's one of those, one of the forces there.
Yes.
Plus all the other
things. But we need both of these countries on track to help the Syrian situation. We need to stay engaged. We need to keep on the political diplomatic track. And let's just hope that some of the mediators who have decided to step in, like Iraq, maybe Egypt will step in, are able to diffuse this, because there's never been a more serious time, to get serious about peace.
Anybody else got anything to say before we change the subject? I'll take this moment.
I just hope, as you mentioned, that the diplomatic forces are working hard behind the scenes on this one. I know they're both appealing to domestic politics and trying to whip up hysteria for that reason, but let's hope they both have
cooler heads prevail.
Cooler heads prevail.
I would like to take this moment to say hello to our listeners on Sirius XM Radio, Channel 124, the POTUS channel, and identify ourselves. You are listening to White House Chronicle. I am Llewellyn King, and with me is Linda Gasparello of this program, and Farah Stockman, editorial writer and columnist for the Boston Globe. For the TV, I'm going to hold up the Boston Globe, but I don't think it works for anybody else.
Radio.
Certainly not on
radio.
radio. And our old friend Ed Achorn, the very talented writer, who is also the editorial page editor of the Providence Journal.
Hold up, Prov.
Rhode Island. I will hold up the Providence Journal. If anybody can see it, I don't know if the camera's picking it up or not. There you are. We heard on 4 times on Sirius XM, POTUS 124 on the weekends. We're also on about 200 American television stations and around the globe on the English language services, radio and television of the Voice of America. Back to the world we live in. Let's leave the Middle East and what concerns you in your reporting outside of the Middle East? How do you think we're doing domestically?
Well, I've spent a lot of time this year reporting about race. I did a project on school desegregation in Boston. 40 years later, how schools and the disparities. And so I think one of the big challenges facing America right now, and you can see it sort of echoing in politics, is the continuing racial divide and how it intersects with class and demographic changes. I mean, we're in for some really profound demographic changes that I think people are scared without necessarily even understanding how profound they're going to be. So if you look at the census projections, in 40 years, 1 out of every 3 children in America will be white, and 1 out of every 3 children in America will be Hispanic. So very vast demographic changes. And so we're heading to a society where the older generation is going to be mostly white and probably more conservative and probably well off. And then younger people will be growing up in a very multicultural environment where whites will not be a majority. And I think that's what America is looking at right now.
I think it does worry America. I think it worries every part of America except the Hispanics. I think it worries African American America because they're going to be pushed to a different place. What do you think, Ed?
Well, I think you're really onto something. I think the biggest civil rights challenge of our time is getting our public schools up to speed and trying to educate all children to have an opportunity in this society. And part of that is teaching them what America is, what our system is, what our Constitution is. I don't think this is being taught all that well these days. But I know in my state of Rhode Island, we've got this horrifying disparity between the white, middle class suburbs and the inner city. It's just shocking. It's one of the biggest divides in the country. Yeah. And to fix this, you're going to have to shake up some of these forces of the status quo, and that's very difficult to do.
Farah, this brings me to your busing investigation. Mm-hmm. Did that help at all? That's what it was supposed to do, was to ameliorate that.
I think so. School desegregation. There are in Boston. There were a lot of benefits that came out of it, but there was a huge backlash. Boston was probably the worst place in the North. And the backlash drove so many middle-class people and white people out of the system. And so it undermined the goal of integration and of quality education. And so we're still experiencing so many of the same things. I did a lot of looking at schools in Boston, and you can find there are 5 schools that are 90% Hispanic. Those are the kind of numbers that the judge looked at 40 years ago and said, "Oh, you guys have segregation." So we're still there. And so the question is, do we still go back to integration as the answer, or do we look for other ways? And I think with the charter school debate, charter schools are saying, well, we don't need white kids to make a good school. Let us just take these kids and we're going to make a great school.
What are the facts on charter schools, though? What's their success rate? And
you can find great charter schools in Boston. Yeah. You can also find not so great ones. I don't know that. I think just being a charter means you have flexibility to do things that work. Charter schools are in school for 2 hours a day longer. Some of them, they are in school for weeks longer. So they are able to do things because they don't have a teachers union. They're able to really make a long school day that catches kids up, and in a way that I think public schools haven't been able to.
Yeah.
Ed, what do you think the fixes here are?
Right. It's more than just putting kids of different color skins in the same classroom. I think it's a holistic approach. You've got to bring in parents. And a lot of these schools have done an exceptionally good job of this, which is why I think the charter school movement is so important. Some of them work better than others, but it's great to have this experiment to see, are there models that can work with some of the poorest neighborhoods in the country, and it's quite extraordinary what some of these schools are achieving. And obviously you can't change the schools based on charter schools. You've got to roll out some of what they've learned into the standard public schools, and I'm hopeful that can happen. But there are very strong forces trying to prevent that from happening.
I think that on top of it, you really have got to look at the support from neighborhoods and from families.
That's what
Honestly,
the schools discover.
we have a friend who started a charter school very altruistically in Chicago. And I think he's done some really remarkable things. But what he notices is that kids are bullied on their way back home from school through their neighborhoods. They're beat up by kids who say, "You think you're better than we are?" You've got families at home that are completely dysfunctional, that don't support the child trying to do better, can't support the child trying to, would like to but just can't. Children arriving exhausted, and basically the faculty having to become parents, social workers, on top of just trying to teach the kids something about U.S. history.
Yeah.
It's really that bad.
It's true of public schools as well. I mean, one of the reasons they don't do so well is in a lot of inner cities is that you're dealing with some kids who haven't eaten breakfast.
Absolutely.
Kids who saw their cousin be shot last week.
Right.
They have so many more problems. But this is why, I mean, right now we have this huge divide. We have a racial divide, but we also have the class divide. And the difference, if you look at the achievement gap today between rich and poor is far bigger than it ever was in the 60s between black and white. I mean, wealthy people are able to do things for their kids from the age of 0 that even normal people, even middle class people just cannot. And
That's
so
right.
this is something I think we're going to be seeing for years to come in the United States as we talk about income inequality.
And
more
it's
so,
generational.
more so, not
It's
less so, as you
generational.
get people who
Right.
are a new aristocracy of wealth, which
Right.
is going to be self-perpetuating because wealth
Absolutely.
is down through the centuries unless it is changed.
Absolutely.
At
But what
this-
I find extraordinarily encouraging is in some of these schools in Rhode Island, the achievement gap is disappearing between these rich suburbs and these very poor neighborhoods. They've figured out a model that works to help these students, and I just hope this can be sort of encouraged and build on that, understanding the horrific problems kids from poor neighborhoods face.
Yeah.
I have heard that part of the problem is in teaching that if you have, particularly with African Americans, where you have a dialect, that prepositions, for example, mean different things. He sick, he be sick, are two different things. That often these teachers don't understand that the kids are hearing something different. This was quite an actively pursued some years ago, and I think it's gone into some abeyance. I think it must have a role, how people speak, because of localized dialects.
Well, I definitely think teachers, having teachers from the community is really important, not just because of dialect issues, but just because they're the most likely to really be good role models and really understand what kids are
the children.
going
And
through.
what
Right,
the
and get the
chil-
trust of the children.
You've
I
got
mean,
to
these are-
understand what the child is facing.
Yeah.
But I will say, go back, if you want to talk about language, I mean, this is the issue with Hispanic students. It's going to be a huge issue. In Boston, we now have Hispanic students are 40%. There are more Hispanic students than black students in the Boston public schools.
And from the Washington area, there are some teachers teaching in public schools that are dealing with more than 70 languages.
Sure,
Sure. Very difficult.
Although interestingly,
Yes?
the first generation immigrants, once they learn English, they do better than kids that were born in America. They tend to do better. So if you look at children of Somali refugees tend
Right.
to do better than black American kids. Why is that?
So
there's a
obviously
different
we should have
motivation.
huge emphasis on learning English. But interesting, in talking about minorities, we tend not to mention Asians in education because they tend to do rather better than either whites or African Americans or Hispanics. How does that fit into your research?
I didn't look deeply at Asians in Boston, but it's true that they if you look at test scores or who's getting into the best schools, exam schools, they tend to do pretty well.
It's obviously it's not just schools, it's a whole culture that feeds into schools, and that's what we have to work on. We have to try to figure out ways that some students benefit and expand that as much as we can to other students.
I think we should also help to make teaching more exciting, because the thing that really motivates kids, I think, is when you just blow their minds, when you've got a field trip that they can look forward to, when they've got enough time in their curriculum to do things that are way off the path.
I think I was a poor student, and certainly the extracurricular things like theater meant everything to me.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the stuff they're cutting. Yeah.
That's the stuff
Music,
they're cutting.
theater, things that are really, really
Music and
important for
theater,
child
and
development.
You can get educated through by tertiary means if you're pursuing music or if you're pursuing art or theater. There are other ways to get education than directly hitting the books, but that seems to be almost forgotten.
I
That's
remember
very
the
sad.
excitement of field trips to the Museum of Science when I was a child growing up in Massachusetts and in public school at the time, and I thought, this is just wonderful. I was a terrible science student, but after I went to the Museum of Science, I actually took an interest in it and did better.
Too much of education is funded by property taxes.
Farah, I want to ask you in closing, what has been the reaction in the Boston Globe to the movie Spotlight?
It's pretty cool. I mean, the movie is super accurate. I think there's only one scene, the golf scene, that didn't necessarily...
The one scene I thought was Sunday, the paper appeared to be closed. No major metropolitan newspaper is closed on Sunday.
It was eerily accurate. Marty Baron, Sasha Pfeiffer, Mike Resendiz, their characters were spot on.
It's a good movie.
They learned later that some in Hollywood said, that you should make a love scene between these people. And they were like, no. But luckily they didn't sensationalize.
Thank goodness.
And so this makes the staff feel pretty good?
It does. It does.
Well, you were at the Post when Watergate
I was at the Post
breaking.
during Watergate, but it was so... We didn't have a separate unit like Spotlight, which was a separate unit, which many newspapers had. We had it for something else, but that's not who handled Watergate. It was handled by two city-side local reporters, but we were kind of excluded because the rest of the staff was excluded. We didn't know any more than we read in the paper when we got the stories to edit and put in the paper.
The same with Spotlight, right?
We had no idea, so that people would ask us about it, and we didn't know anything. We just gave our opinions of the reporters who were our friends, and there we are. That's our show for today. Keep the spotlight on your television when we're on White House Chronicle, coming to you with Linda Gasparello, Farah Stockman, and Ed Achorn today. Cheers and all the best for the week. Bye-bye.